When kings and queens of Great Britain died over the centuries, there were usually huge state occasions which marked the burial and interment of the monarch. For example, during the funeral procession of King Henry VIII, the notorious Tudor king, Henry's procession was so large that the streets of Windsor had to be widened to allow it to pass. He today is buried inside of St George's Chapel under the choir of the building. However, the most recent burial of a monarch saw Queen Elizabeth II and her consort Prince Philip being interred inside of a specially commissioned chantry chapel that had been built within St George's on the request of Elizabeth II. These were not buried inside of the royal vault. However, Prince Philip's remains were for some time leading to the suggestion that possibly someone knew that the death of his wife Elizabeth II may have been just around the corner and quite soon. The royal vault that sits under St George's Chapel today is considered full or close to it, with the coffins of dozens of royals and minor royals inside of it. But what is this, and what does it look like? As a building, St George's Chapel is known as a royal peculiar. It is a building that is under the direct authority of royalty and the monarchy, and it does not necessarily fall inside of a parish. Over the centuries, it became a place where many people were interred and buried, and there were many different chapels that were created inside of St George's for smaller worship and dedication to royals. A chapel was made in Windsor Castle's walls and was rededicated to George the Martyr, but it then became known as St George's Chapel. Throughout the Wars of the Roses and the early Tudor period, there was extensive redevelopment to the building, but during the English Civil War, there was a lot of destruction in the building. There was pillaging and plundering by parliamentarian forces, but following the execution of King Charles I, the executed king was buried there, alongside Henry VIII, who had been buried with his third wife, Jane Seymour, in a specially built vault. Further changes and restoration was made throughout the reigns of the Georgians and Queen Victoria. One of the first monarchs buried inside of St George's was Edward IV, and it stated that he was to be buried in a vault with a chapel or closest over it, with space for an altar and a tomb with his figure of silver and gilt, or at least copper and gilt. The will further provided for a chantry of 2 priests and for the company of 13 poor bedsmen to live within the college. The king's bones were left for a number of centuries, but they were then discovered when work was done to repair and change parts of St George's to the wishes of King George III. Edward IV had been buried inside one of the first royal vaults, and the vault itself was small, 9 feet long and under 4 feet wide, and it had a number of arches in it. The remains of a wooden coffin with the skull and bones of Elizabeth Woodville lay on top of a lead coffin, and these had been put in there. The coffin of Edward IV was opened, and his complete skeleton was found, and even shoulder-length brown hair was found on his head. One eyewitness claimed that, when the coffin was opened, the body bore its natural form but soon fell to powder. The point of this is that there were actually a number of individual burial vaults for the royals found inside of the chapel. However, King George III ordered the excavation and building of a proper royal burial vault underneath the floor of the chapel. This became known as the Tomb House, and inside of this vault are a number of different shelves which are held behind iron bars, and today there are 25 bodies of members of the royal family who are buried in their coffins in this part of the royal vault. The bodies are literally slid onto the shelves and then have been left in this manner. One of the first people to be buried in the royal vault was Princess Charlotte in 1817, and she died following giving birth. The tomb house holds the remains of many different royals, including King George III, George IV, William IV, and many of their grandchildren, children, and other family members. The first to be interred in the royal vault was Princess Amelia in 1810, the daughter of George III and his wife Charlotte. There is near to the shelf a few central plinths, and these, the coffins of a number of kings and queens, were placed in the centre, highlighting their importance. Some images of the royal vault even show the coffins carrying a number of crowns. Throughout the centuries, there were some rearrangements and changes to the royal vault, and different monarchs could stipulate the arrangements and organisation of the different coffins. Some had coffins placed on the racking at the side, and others had closer relatives on the plinths in the central point. With regards to gaining access to the royal vault, there is one which is accessed by a staircase for those who have clearance, for example the priests who regularly go and pray down there, but the other entry is through an elevator or a lift mechanism in the central part of the chapel, and this is a hole in the floor which comes up and down, bringing coffins into the royal vault. Coffins are lowered to a chamber below, and this is connected to the royal vault. When the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II took place, the body of the Queen was lowered symbolically into said royal vault, using the electronic lift. Her incredibly heavy coffin was then brought back out of the vault hours after the funeral had taken place, because she was to be buried inside of a small chantry chapel alongside her father, King George VI, and her mother. The remains of Elizabeth II were then interred here. Philip, her consort, Prince Philip as he was better known, had his coffin held inside the royal vault for roughly a year, and this was done so that there would not be two separate interments inside of the memorial chapel. Someone must have known that the Queen did not have long left, or the plan was to always hold Philip's body in the royal vault before burying him with his wife together. The process for burials inside of the royal vault was as followed. The funeral service would take place inside of St George's Chapel, followed by the committal, and this would see the coffin being lowered into the royal vault using the lift fitted into the chapel near to the altar. The coffin was then either placed on the central part of the vault, or it was stored away on the different shelvings held behind the iron railings. The vault itself is believed to have been rather cool. It is not refrigerated, leading to the conclusion that the remains tend to stay in a good sense of preservation due to the temperature. There are other small vaults as mentioned, but these are not the actual royal vault, for example Henry VIII's vault, and also Elizabeth II's. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.